It is my great pleasure to introduce my former colleague, Professor Dr. Christina Morina. Tina is Professor of Contemporary History at the University of Bielefeld in Germany. Her dissertation is entitled Legacies of Stalingrad, Remembering the Eastern Front War in Germany since 1945. She has also published a number of books, articles, and interviews on modern German political and intellectual history, as well as memory culture. From 2015 to 2019, she was visiting assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam. And that was where our paths crossed. And in that position, I had the pleasure of working with Tina as a colleague and found that next to being a real expert in the field of GDR history, Tina is also an eyewitness with a personal history, as she was born and socialized for a big part of her childhood in the GDR. Today, however, her focus is less on her personal experience as a former citizen, but as an expert in what she herself called the failed experiment of a democratic-antifascist socialism in East Germany. In her lecture today, she will explore and she will trace the legacy of the German partition when it comes to ideas of democracy, participation, and representation in East and West Germany. And she will weigh their potential impact on the future of liberal democracy as we know it. In her lecture, Tina will at times pause to let you, as our viewers, interact and share your thoughts. You cannot use your microphones, but you can, and we ask you to engage in the conversation by using the chat. I will be active in the background, collecting your questions to support the interaction between our audience and the speaker. We also kindly ask you to use the Q&A pod to write down questions you would like to discuss at the end of this lecture. So, but now I've said enough, and I would like to hand over to Tina. So, Bühne frei, liebe Tina, the stage is yours, and I will mute and blind myself and hand over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Kerstin and Alcuna, for the invitation, your super preparation and prepping me for becoming ready for this talk. Hello, everyone out there in different parts of the world, different parts in the US. I'm an historian, and the title of my lecture begins with the future. So you know that I'm actually not the expert in the room. The younger generation is said to be experts on creating the future, and who knows, maybe the 5 points that you come up with in this competition will lay the groundwork for some better future society plan to be realized in the future. So I'm happy that you take some interest in German history, but maybe even more important, real interest in the question of democracy and democratic participation in particular. And I've divided our conversation, and I really hope that we will be able, even though we are not in the same room, not in the same country, not even in the same continent, to have some kind of a conversation in the next hour or so. I've divided my lecture into 4 parts, which I'm now gonna show you. There you go. So there are 4 parts. I'll begin with the topic of utopia, then move on to how that utopia, in particular in East Germany, was being challenged in the 1980s in particular, and then leading up to the fall of the wall. Then there's a part that's called disillusion, where I want to question with you and also based on the history of divided and then united Germany and Europe, the issue of what happened with liberal democracy after it had won the Cold War in a way. And the last section is dedicated to some possible lessons to be learned or your lessons to be drawn from this lecture and from spending a little bit of time dealing with the history of divided Germany and versions of democracy that were attempted to be realized in the later 20th century in Germany, particularly in the East. So moving on to the first part, and there will be, as Kerstin mentioned, there will be 3 moments in which I will turn to you and hope you will join me via the chat and responding, sharing your thoughts on 3 separate issues that I want to raise, and I hope you can relate to those as we move forward. So The meaning of democratic socialism. As you know, Germany was divided following World War II because it was occupied, it was defeated and occupied by 4 different political powers and military powers. In the West, it was occupied by the US, Great Britain, and France, and in the East by Russia, which then was called Soviet Union. And those 4 occupation powers represented 2 different versions or ideas of how to organize society. In the West, the Western model was the liberal democratic model, the representational parliamentary democracy that was favored and realized in those states that came into Germany from the West. And from the East, the Soviet Union, since 1917, had implemented an entirely new model called socialism or communism, based on the idea that bourgeois society and capitalism should and can be overcome by collectivizing, by communalizing property and businesses, by sharing, by giving everyone an equal and egalitarian part in the Commonwealth, and organizing that society around a leading political party. And as you can see from the picture that the background of this slide is a picture of the inner German, not the wall in Berlin, but the inner German border within Germany. That was a death border, because if you came too close from the East, you were being shot. That happened to hundreds of people across time, across the 40 years of German partition. And as an illustration of the democratic utopia, to put it that way, the idea of democracy that was implemented in the West and in the East, I've pulled a section from the respective constitutions, the basic law, as it was called in West Germany, in the Federal Republic, and the constitution, as it was called in the German Democratic Republic in the East. So in the West, the state itself and society itself declared itself a democratic and social federal state. All state authority is derived from the people. It shall be exercised by the people through elections and other votes, and through specific legislative, executive, and judicial bodies. So there's a clear delineation of how power is being distributed and decided, how things are being run in that society, namely through elections and specific bodies that share the power to be distributed in society and in the state. And in the East, things were quite different. The German Democratic Republic called itself a socialist state of the German nation. It is the political organization of the working population in town and country, who are jointly realizing socialism under the leadership of the working class and its Marxist-Leninist party. So you have a clear contrast that in the East, society is organized around the idea that the main criteria by which society is being organized is that of the working population, the workers and the farmers, which in turn are being represented by only one leading party, namely the Marxist-Leninist party, that is based on the idea put forward by Marx, Engels, Lenin. And of course, in the course of those decades since Marx, Engels, and Lenin lived and wrote their writings, these ideas of socialism as a political system were being appropriated and changed quite dramatically to fit a rather modern and pretty radical social engineering that was put in place since 1917 in Russia. And then following World War II, with the defeat of Nazism, of fascism and National Socialism in Germany, in the Eastern European part of the European continent. So, as you know, laws are not something that falls from heaven, but they are being made by people in power who come to power in certain ways. And they in turn structure society and how it's being organized. So I want to put out the question to you, is democracy then, as you have seen being described and realized in these 2 different settings that I just laid out, what is it? Is it a system, is it a sort of idea? Is it in utopia? What do you understand by utopia? Maybe you can share your thoughts via the chat. And Aikuna and Kerstin will help gather your responses. So, is democracy an utopia? Why would you say it is an utopia? What is an utopia in your view? How would you describe it? Any ideas for us to be discussed jointly? I know that the term socialism is something that frequently comes up in US politics. It plays quite a prominent role as, you know, as a term for a certain politics that often is presented as being a threat to liberal democracy. So I see Shreya, who says, I'd say an utopia is a perfect society with no issues and hindrances. Yeah, right. Kind of an ideal, right? An ideal idea of a society organized around certain principles. Jillian answers that no, because utopia is an impossibly perfect society. So there's a hint at that comment hints at there's an idea that in reality is quite difficult to realize, and by definition, then that idea is and will remain an utopia. Quite right. Yeah, I find that Carson says, I find that a utopia is an ideal concept impossible to attain in the world as we know it. So that kind of resonates with Jillian's comments. Democracy is a closer political model to utopia, but society is unable to conform to the ideals of a utopia. Very nicely put, yes. And then Georgia adds, democracy is always imperfect. Agree, says Abigail. In democracy, you need to compromise with those you disagree with, right? It has to be routinely challenged in order for us to progress. Yes, very nice. And Isabel adds, I would say utopia is a society with equality. And I think democracy can contribute to people having their voices heard. Yeah. In the QA, a comment that democracy, says Kerstin, that democracy is a utopia for some regions of the world. That's true. That adds a perspective from afar, you know, that the aspiration of becoming a democratic, just society in a utopian, visionary way is something that people aspire to in other countries, other countries, parts of the world where, you know, conditions are much, much worse than in the more freer societies. Yes. So thanks for your reactions. Indeed, it's important. I want to stress that with regards to East Germany, that this was a system that was not only put in place from above by tanks, by the Soviet army coming into Germany and imposing a system that was invented in Moscow in the decades before, but rather it was an idea that was quite attractive to a lot of people, not the least people who had survived or resisted against Nazism, and who now thought the eastern part of Germany was doing it the only right way. It would root out the roots of fascism, namely capitalism. It would redistribute wealth, businesses, factories, the production, the means of production in the society, and would just get rid of people having tremendous economic and therefore political power, and create a more egalitarian society. So it was an ideal that was put in place very much in contrast to what we would call liberal, or what they would call bourgeois society. If you look up what East Germans themselves, and here of course you have the state perspective that again was shared by many in the country, not only by those in the leading party echelons. They would define socialist democracy as the political power of the working masses, of the people led by the working class and its Marxist-Leninist party. with the dictatorship of the proletariat, it overcomes and supersedes formal bourgeois democracy. So the belief or the promise was that by having a party that represents all working people, by definition, you would get rid of the formal divisions, the class divisions that would continue to exist in bourgeois society, and thus also the injustices that exist there. And you would have something that equals a dictatorship, even explicitly, but connected to it was the promise that this dictatorship would actually be an egalitarian and more just society, because the great majority rules among itself, so to say. So, and as you see from the pictures that I chose to illustrate my points, this was something, these ideas and this ideal was closely tied to education, to the upbringing of children, to young people who were seen as representing the future of that idea and that alternative version of German democracy. And on the left, you see young pioneers in school, regularly coming together in collective gatherings. And of course, the entire system was based on a collectivist idea of society, not an individualist one, right? So the common collective interests and beliefs were put above individual interests, because it was believed that that would lead rather to a more egalitarian and just society. You can see in the back the term freedom, peace. Peace needs your action. And peace was very important. That again is the backdrop of the Second World War, that it was believed that only socialism can guarantee a peaceful society in the future. On the right, you see something similar that then also happens regularly on the adult level, with factories and group of workers coming together to celebrate the party leadership in the back. You can see that in the back, and that is the 20th anniversary of the GDR that was here celebrated in that picture. So the question is, and how far this was something, as you see from the title here, how far this idea was put into practice. The GDR existed for 40 years, and increasingly it turned out that the economic part of the idea that nobody owns the factories, but it's commonly owned, and businesses are run from state bureaucrats rather than from individual entrepreneurs. That idea turned out to be rather difficult, and the GDR always had tremendous economic problems. The idea that only one party represents the people as a collective, also turned out to be something that inspired great dissent over time, that people, including those who went to church, who continued to adhere to religious worldviews, felt restricted and suppressed in their freedom of expression, something that was existent on paper, but very much through state-sponsored media, newspapers, and a security system and a security apparatus that kind of permeated the society on a whole, with hundreds of thousands of people engaged in supervising and observing that people went in line with what the official line was. That's something that over the years led to a challenge of the idea of a democratic socialism or socialist democracy. And these events, as some of you might know, then culminated in the revolution, the peaceful revolution of 1989. On the left, you see one of the greatest demonstration in East Germany to be held before the fall of the wall in October 1989 in Leipzig, where 70,000 people courageously, because there was still not sure whether the regime would use violence to suppress these demonstrations, had gathered to demonstrate for reforms, for open elections, for free elections. And in fact, elections which were being held in East Germany were all but free. They were all but secret. It was a highly controlled, centralized, functionalized system. And people started increasingly to question that election system. And in May of 1889, that kind of resistance and opposition formed around the communal elections. And this is, now we are 2 weeks before the US election, where the actual methods and the ways of voting, the technicalities of the process that is so kind of sacred to the idea of democracy is very much debated and at the center of attention. You can probably or hopefully relate to the theme and the problems that I mentioned here, that people increasingly were frustrated with the hollow election system of the GDR, and opposition kind of crystallized around that issue. And it led, I'm going to be very brief, this challenge of the system, which in the beginning was not even a challenge of the idea of democratic socialism or socialist democracy, but of the regime and the way the party, the one party, claimed to be representing all the people. That was something that initially prompted people to take to the streets and initially demonstrate for reformed socialism. And that included, of course, the original idea of socialism of the 19th century included freedom and liberty. So they climbed up the wall and tore down the wall because it was the symbol and kind of the materialization of an unfree version, a perversion in a way of the idea of socialism. So, and that's an event that I remember. It's a secular, dramatic, historic event that formed the world ever since. You know that the rest of Eastern Europe was also liberating itself in much the same peaceful ways, but there were also other cases where violence played a much more crucial role, and it was not without bloodshed that this ended the Soviet-style socialist experiment. But it started in a way with more and more people, instead of being complacent and just restricting to the rights they were given and the freedoms, the little freedoms they were given, they would take to the street and demonstrate it. So back to you. There's a question. Have you ever been to a demonstration? If so, what for? Have you even torn down a wall in your lifetime? Have you had the experience to participate in something that was rather dramatic, rather consequential in terms of taking to the streets to achieve an actual goal, not just to make public your concerns? But what are those demonstrations that you might have participated in your lifetime? So I'm again looking at the chat. And there's, of course, one of the first, and I have a picture of that as well, because it's the demonstration culture of the year and of the past few years is Fridays for Future, which of course is a global movement that took to the streets the concerns about climate change. Georgia wrote that she participated in one in the city of Hanover, which I assume is not the German, but the US city. Another one says no. Any other comments? Yes, in Germany, yes. Oh, then Georgia was participating in Hanover in Germany. Isabel says she participated in a people's vote with regards to the EU referendum. All right, yes. So there are different issues that people take to the street too. A Remain march in London, says Abigail. I've been to the March for Our Lives that occurred in 2018. I was also present at the 2016 Women's March, says Nathan. Kevin says, not yet, but he keeps his fingers crossed. So I assume he hopes to have the chance soon to do that. The March for Our Lives in DC, another one, Nathan was there as well. Why do you say unfortunately? Reis Schepke writes, unfortunately, I have not attended a demonstration yet. Do we think that's it's generally something positive to take to the streets and chant slogans, draw posters? Maybe you can say something about it. I was just a bystander, writes Patrick, at one of my universities, the University of Connecticut, after the 2016 election at the main building. I assume in protest of, or in open a critique of Trump's election victory, I would assume. Another one that took part in the Women's March in Boston, where he wore or held a poster reading "Red for Education," Red for Ed, very, very nice, yeah. The March for Science in Rochester, yes, I remember that. This was also something global. Here in Münster, where I'm at the moment, there was also a demonstration for science at some point, I think, in last year. And Georgia responds, yes, I think attending demonstrations is really exciting, powerful, empowering. Yes, correct, says Patrick. Yes, it is. Aside from voting or organizing yourself in a conventional political party, of course, gathering for a demonstration, taking to the streets, finding partners and comrades and spirits, so to say, via social media most of all these days, is of course a very effective way, and in a way also very low energy way to organize something like that and to decide I'm going to go to a demonstration. Even though, of course, we know that in recent months and in societies where liberty and the freedom to gather and to demonstrate is not as absolute as in, let's say, Germany. Even in the US, it has been quite risky for some people to take to the streets in the Black Lives Matter context, as we know from recent months. So yeah, it's nice to hear that many of you have already made that experience and share some have an idea of how it feels to become part of a large group of people that shares a common objective, a common goal, often in resistance against something and not that often in kind of support of something, right? That's a lot of times that's the crucial differentiation. And you could say in a way that opposition inspires often a more energetic response from the street. If you are for something in a liberal democracy, of course, you have to think about strategies to achieve that goal, because taking to the street is one way of shifting public opinion, raising awareness. But if you really want to change something, you of course have to channel your energy into the procedures, the elections, the institutions that were mentioned at the very beginning on the West German constitution, if you remember. I'm going to read one more longer comment from Regan. Most times it feels uplifting to chant for a cause that you believe in among people with similar beliefs, right? At other times, I can feel exhausting to scream and fight with every fiber in your body. It can feel exhausting to scream and fight with every fiber in your body when the people in charge persistently show that they are unwilling to listen and make change, right? That's kind of a feeling of Ohnmacht, of being unable to change anything, right? Total losing control of your own life. And if that collides or coincides with kind of larger strands of history, that you feel trapped in historic circumstances that kind of dramatically and fundamentally influence your life and you can't do anything about it. That's something that makes people indeed feel very powerless, and which at the same time can become a very powerful fuel for participation, for raising your engagement and commitment to participation. And that's something that people in East Germany, and that now I'm going to slowly move towards the lessons that I might want to discuss with you at the end, making this experience that if you are taking to the streets by the thousands, if you are creative, and they were often funny with their posters that they threw at the SED, the comrades, at the old communists that ruled them, finding ways to get around the secret police, finding ways to make yourself heard via the Western media. That is a very important part of that story, that the East Germans were able, via journalists, via secret channels, to make it into the main news in West Germany. And then that main news in West Germany was seen in turn again by people in East Germany and kind of fortified that resistance, because the next day people thought, oh, look at how many people were on the streets in Leipzig last night. We have to go too. And that kind of caused a dynamic and inspired a dynamic that indeed, at the end of the day, led to human beings, ordinary human beings, tearing down the wall against military resistance and military power that was indeed able to just destroy them, right, and kill them on the streets, which luckily didn't happen. And that kind of experience is something that still plays in East Germany, that all of us try to preserve. There's an official discourse that celebrates unity as a peaceful, a tremendously positive event, one of the most positive events in German history. And I myself, my family, most of us felt purely, joy, feeling liberated, being part of history in an unbelievably positive, energizing way. And for some people, the reality that kicked in after the fall of the wall and the end of unification, the end of division and the unification of Germany, which of course meant that the entire system of socialism, of socialized economy, was being transformed into a modest but still, liberal market economy, a capitalist system with millions losing their jobs, with large factories just turning out to be worthless, that was sold for a few German marks to investors who then built something new with far less workers because the entire system was very unproductive, quite ineffective before the fall of the wall. That led to a total transformation of East German society, including the teachers, university professors, lawyers, judges were kicked out of their positions, often also with good reason, because they were representatives of the old repressive system. And West German experts came in, teachers, professors, lawyers came in, economists, and took over and kind of built a small West Germany in a way from scratch and in a very short time. So whereas West German society had about 40 years to come over the war, overcome the consequences of the Second World War and learning democracy over generations, East Germans were forced, first they wanted to, they invited that development, but they then were forced to learn democracy, learn liberal capitalist market economy in a few years, in this time span of 3 to 4 years. That was a quite dramatic experience that for many in East Germany still reverberates in not only positive ways. So the sense of empowerment and of taking your fate and the fate of your country in your own hands is something that didn't last very long. Or you can put it also differently, it lasted quite strongly in particular parts of East German society, where you can see that chants here on the left, Wir sind das Volk, we are the people, which is the chant of the revolution 89, is something that reoccurred in the course of the 2000s and 2010 years. Now the last two decades, 1 to 2 decades, where people became frustrated again with the development of unified Germany, and the memory of the revolution and of that empowerment of being anti the leading party, and then now it's the anti-leading parties, the established parties, anti the media, the established media environment. That is something that people had learned in East Germany to be critical of what the newspapers tell them, with good reason, but that's something that survived kind of subconsciously or under the surface, and that could be reactivated in the 2000s, particularly after the financial crisis, when the globalized world with its globalized crises and not only opportunities kind of hit home in those parts of Germany that had already struggled particularly intensely with economic transformation and social transformation. A lot of people had left the east of Germany. I had left, people like me, young women also in particular had left the east. And so all of these developments led to a sustained sense of frustration, of a feeling of being a second class citizen, not really being having been arrived in the West German liberal idea of democracy. And guys like him here on the right, Björn Höcke, who is the local leader the leader of one of the local branches of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is the right-wing populist party in Germany that has now, has a firm foot in the parliament as well since 2017. The rise of that party was fueled by the frustration that I just mentioned and the sense of having lost control of their own fate again after once having had that control in the years following the financial crisis, and then also in particular 2015 when 1 million refugees were welcomed in Germany from Syria mostly, and where the AfD, took the opportunity. That was as a historic window of opportunity for the right-wing populists in Germany to find a lot of followers. So, and in the back of Björn Höcke's poster that is from an election campaign a few years ago, it says Wende 2.0. The Wende is the popular word for the revolution in period. And it's kind of the revolution 2.0. They forcefully and fully embraced that legacy, the memory of the '89 revolution, and promised, he's himself coming from the West, of course, as most of the leaders of the AfD, they would settle in the East and promise people, you are no longer second-class Germans, you are the true Germans. This is how Germany should look like, and not like Frankfurt and Hanover and Cologne, where too many migrants are living and multiculturalism has taken over. So that's the kind of narrative they took to the streets in East Germany. And again, people, a lot of people, 25–30% vote for the AfD in the East. And that's a challenge, of course, that is not something that is limited to East Germany. Here again, I'm showing you, this is a dramatic day in August of 2018, where people, again with the chant, Wir sind das Volk, the revolutionary chant, we are the people, gathered in Karl-Marx-Stadt, which was now Chemnitz. It used to be Karl-Marx-Stadt. And the demonstration was followed by racist, xenophobic violence in the city. Quite a dramatic turn of events that woke everybody up in Germany. And we realized that Germany, after all, is not so different from other countries. For a long time, we thought, given the Nazi past, right-wing extremism is not something that can settle permanently in East Germany, in Germany overall, but it has indeed. And as you can see from this chart overview, there's a rise of right-wing populist voting potential in all of these countries across Europe, especially then since the years 2005, 2015 until today. So the context is important, that this is something that marks a general crisis possibly of liberal democracy, where, as you know, populists promise a different kind of representation. They claim to be representatives of the real folk, of the real people. They criticize the old elites that are organized in all powerful parties that are corrupt. And that is something that speaks to, if you might say, the old wounds of liberal democracy that always carried with it, that a parliament is not a direct way of democracy, it's an indirect way, it's a representative democracy. And there's much to be criticized and to be wanting. You could argue that not enough citizens are participating in the politics in representative system. So all of you, we are all invited to think about how this crisis might be solved and whether this is, indeed the end of an era of liberal democracy as quite a few political scientists fear. So we have to be careful what we remember and what we plan to do with the lessons from history that tell us that ideas of empowerment and emancipation and direct participation in political matters can indeed achieve great change for the better, but they at the same time carry also a lot of risks, and it can turn dark and violent even. And I want to conclude my lecture and start our final discussion, maybe via the chat again, with the vision of the monument Germany is planning for the revolution, which is a huge structure on which people can walk. And if enough people walk to one side, the structure will bend. And it kind of imitates the idea that if enough people take to the streets, they can move mountains, literally. And there's much dispute. It's not built yet. There's still arguments around it, but it's a symbol of the idea that even though Germany is a liberal representative democracy, there's much to be remembered about that instant in 1989 when people's courageous taking to the streets kind of took down an entire system and changed it. And their energy still to this day is probably not represented sufficiently in United Germany. I think that's one of the reasons why the AfD, the populists, are so successful in the East, that they find a way to integrate, address, channel those emotions and those interests. And I think there's the area where tasks lie ahead of us. So, and I also wanted to point with the Statue of Liberty, I wanted to point to the worth and the value of remembering great democratic moments, because they can be inspiring and they can indeed teach something. So the big question at the very end is, what have you learned from this particular history? Is there anything? Can you think of ways that might contribute to a way out of the perceived crisis of liberal democracy? What are aspects? Maybe you can, again, write something into the chat about the issues I just discussed with an eye on what you all probably perceive as well as something that is full of crisis and full of problems, and that we live in times where the democratic system is very much under pressure. And I get to the question that Nathan posed. The monument, that is a quick one, well, the monument is planned to be built across the street from the rebuilt castle in the middle of, right in the heart of Berlin. The Wippe, I don't know the term in English on the top, off the top of my head, but it's called in the Volksmund, so the popular mouth says it's a Wippe, a thing where a baby lies in. So Jillian writes, I've learned of the importance in participating in a democratic system and making sure our voices are heard, right? Yes. So there are different ways, right, in which you can let your voice be heard. Maybe you can also, I've only talked about, a few, right? Voting, demonstrating, but of course you can know there are different ways of organizing democracy, or maybe the lack of creativity in that area makes many people wonder whether democracy really works and what they really feel represented, right? So what else have you learned? And you can, feel free to say, I knew everything. I don't think this helps very much. History is over. And I don't think it helps very much in changing and bettering the future. We need different sources of thinking about the future of democracy. I would very much invite comments like that, because I always, I'm always also tend to be skeptical whether history really teaches something in that sense. I saw that, Kerstin, I saw that a few participants raised their arms. Wolfram Weinberg writes, people need to be educated about history and about everyone's responsibility as a citizen. Kevin says, I think we need to fight back against the forces of populism and how important it is to vote. Elections show the state of the country you are living in. That's very true. Yes, certainly. And that's, of course, that goes only when, that is only possible if elections really are secure and free and secret. Yeah. A lesson about the danger of having essentially good ideas captured by others and converted to something that was never the idea. Very, very nicely put. Yeah. So there was one question out of before it disappears on my chat screen. Nathan asks, out of curiosity, why do you think that Eastern Germany in particular has turned to extreme right and left-wing politics? What in recent years has caused them? Is it the wealth inequality between the East and the West or something else? Yeah, that's a very important question. Thank you for asking it. And yes, it's important to point out that it's not only economic reasons. I'm convinced that there are other reasons that explain why people in the East, and before they voted right-wing populists, quite a few people voted for the post-communist party in the East. And I think it has very much to do with different ideas of participation and democracy. People kind of are skeptical about these different layers of representation that kind of characterize representative democracy, where a party is formed on a local level, then a communal level, then a state level, and then you have a federal level. And they are impatient with the many stages you have to go through before an idea or an interest becomes realized. And they have had less time to learn that this kind of system actually works quite well, because it guarantees that the largest possible part of society is being integrated in a process where many different contrasting interests come together. And I think there's this, we have to be a little more patient as well, because it's only been one generation since liberal democracy came to the East. And I think democracy works best if people experience that it is effective and it works their way. And that's something that, of course, doesn't come for free or easy. It's something that is a lot of work, I guess. And so, yes, there are certainly those political kind of normative value systems that persist, that make a difference, and other cultural reasons as well. So that's an important point. It's not only the economy, I think. It's not only material issues, but also that East Germans, we're used to thinking about great ideals. They were, constantly thinking about the big utopia, socialism as an idea, as a paradise on earth. It was part of their daily life to aspire to that ideal, and kind of the frustration and then kind of vanishing of that idea without a utopian substitute, so to say, because democracy, by definition, as you said at the beginning, is not something that is just utopian, right? It's something that is quite pragmatic, and it only works if it has a good measure of pragmatism. That's something, I guess, that kind of left a lacuna in many East Germans' minds. So we should inspire idealist thinking, I guess. So that an answer to Nathan's, I think it was Nathan's question. I do also think, says, I think again, Nathan, it is important that democracy is not universally on a decline. I find hope in popular protests like those in Thailand right now. Yes, yes. There's one further up from populism does not have a chance among educated people, says Wolfram Weinberg. That's a strong thesis. Yeah.
Tina.
Yes.
Hello, I'm back. First of all, I want to thank you so much for this really interesting, inspiring presentation. And you see how much, discussion comes up with our participants. We still have a couple of minutes, so I would like to take over and moderate the whole thing so we can get the most important questions dealt with. Some participants also took the chance to ask questions in the Q&A. And I would like to read some of them to you. One of them I find really interesting is has to do with the fact that you mentioned earlier on that there's a lot of resentment in Eastern German population about feeling of not really having been taken seriously, the whole reunification being more of a takeover than a real valuation of maybe what was also good in the other system. Is there something you would say, some good things from GDR system that maybe should have been incorporated in what today is Germany?
Well, that's also a good one. It's a classic question that quite a few East Germans always would say. There are things that worked better in East Germany. As a woman, you didn't have to be concerned about being the only one in the neighborhood who goes to work, because a lot of women were in the workforce. 80%, 90% were working in East Germany. A huge difference. Childcare that was connected to it was something that was provided much more commonly than in the West for a long time. The right to choose, the woman's right to choose, was something that was implemented earlier on in GDR than in West Germany. Of course, all these issues are tied to some kind of ideological agenda, which I won't go into, but taken apart, that's something that people claim had, something that we could have taken. And in fact, the right to choose paragraph was then implemented in the West. So the East German regulation was transferred also to West Germany, where the time was ripe also to make that change. The medical system, the centralist educational system is something that is sometimes mentioned because of the centralized nature of the state. Many more things were centrally organized in East Germany, and some people think that in some ways, some of those things are more effective if they are centrally organized, and the federal system can be quite a stretch, as we see in the pandemic, for instance, that I have to weigh an unlimited amount of interests sometimes.
What contribution do you imagine the experience of former East Germans could make towards the restructuring of capitalism and political structures deeply impacted by the pandemic, as well as other kinds of crises?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, good we search for it again. It's a great question. Well, there are you could take an idealistic stand and say that the bad economy in East Germany has forced people to be very creative. They are very also content with the simple things in life, which, as you know, is sometimes better for the environment if we limit ourselves to just having what is close by. If your winter vegetables are nearby, you just eat winter vegetables without getting exotic food from around the world, and that's better for climate, for the overall climate. And certainly there are aspects that where you could say, this was. Then it wasn't voluntarily, but we knew that we were satisfied, we were happy with smaller things, with being, complacent and happy with having a limited amount of clothing to choose from. And happiness is not only exclusively tied to materialistic concerns. I think that is certainly something, that is something I alluded to earlier, that that people were used to thinking about what is better, what is more ideal than what we have these days. And their ideas and their creativity kind of got lost along the way in the big transformation since '89. And you might be right that, and there are post-capitalist think tanks, of course, and ideas all over the place. I'm not aware of any particularly East German ideas, but I'm sure there are East German strands within there that take examples that I just mentioned, maybe, and transform it into something that could inform it as a post-pandemic and then also post-capitalist society.